attention to detail. Father, I appreciate it. It's great to be here this evening. Thank you so much for welcoming me. And give me 1 second to get this pulled up. The talk this evening is about Catholic education in general. I've been so blessed to have seen multiple facets of it in my times working with everything from homeschool groups to different dioceses across the United States to colleges, elementary schools, middle schools. And it's such a blessing to be able to work with these well-intentioned individuals that are trying to form souls and lead souls closer to Christ. So we know that it is so countercultural in today's world to be in Catholic education, to be a parent that is trying to form our family in the ways of Christ rather than the world. And so today's talk is going to talk a little bit about Catholic education in general, and then also finish by talking about the role of parents, some of the challenges we have out there, but also some of the opportunities. So I'd like to start by posing a question to the group here. Why does Catholic education exist? Why does the Catholic Church promulgate Catholic education? So I'm looking for two answers, and you've already got one, I'm sure. So, yes.
I'm going to be raising my hand. Well, the whole purpose of the church exists to evangelize and to form souls. So that is the primary, to make disciples. So that's part of the parcel of the Catholic school formation, part of the catechesis that involves with evangelization.
It's always good when we have experts in the room. That is perfect. Yes. So the church promulgates Catholic education first and foremost to forward its ecclesial mission, to evangelize, to form people so that they can be of the world but not of the world, and ultimately reach salvation as their ultimate goal. So that's the first reason. The second reason that Catholic education, the schools structure that is set up by the Catholic Church, why the Catholic Church has within its diocesan structure schools themselves and promotes that, is for what reason? Can you help us out with the second answer? Okay. Any other thoughts? So one is for the ecclesial mission of the church. The other reason is to do what? What? Teach the truth, right? So that's a part of the ecclesial mission, absolutely.
Serve the community.
To serve the community, but more specifically, to serve the family. Right. Parents as the first educators have a lot on their plates, and they juggle a lot. And so the Catholic education has been set up as a tool to assist families, and parents in particular, as the primary educators, to help their children reach salvation. So those are the two primary reasons that Catholic education is set up. So as we go through today's talk today, that's really the primary, my first question out of the gate is the talk in essence. So I like to say we're done right there, but unfortunately, it's not that easy. Because again, we live in a secular age, a secular world. Even though the battle has been won, there are still forces out there that push against it. And even within Catholic education itself, there are people that don't necessarily understand what those 2 points mean. So I love starting with this quote from a wonderful saint. And for those of you in the back, I'll point out just a couple of key words. So at the very heart of the church's mission is to educate in the truth. He talks about how in a culture where morality may be seen to be relative, that is more important than ever. And that's why we see so many institutions that don't have a strong mission focus, that haven't adhered to their Catholic identity, start to waver from that. And by recognizing that truth is the primary goal, that is both an obligation and expectation for everyone within Catholic education, is to pursue that truth. So we start with that quote. The next slide is going to look at the 3 points we're going to discover in the next half hour or so. So the first is the current landscape. What challenges, opportunities, what do things look like out there in the world of Catholic education? We'll talk specifically about Catholic education in the United States. We won't talk so much about the history, but more where we are right now. We'll talk about the Catholic Church's role. We'll look at some fundamental documents and some fundamental quotes upholding Catholic education. And then we'll talk, of course, about that bedrock of American society, the family, the bedrock of the church, the domestic church. So to talk about the current landscape, we have to define a few terms. And a few terms that unfortunately are part of the modern lexicon, which get thrown about here and there. And it's important for us to recognize it because of how absurd they are and how readily people speak these terms as a truth. So post-truth, culture crisis, or cancel culture is a part of that. And then, of course, postmodernism. So going through each of these, it's very interesting that in 2016, the Oxford Dictionary declared this the word of the year. Post-truth, what a terrible word. To go post-truth, and you can see, you can't read on the left, but frequency of word use, how that has skyrocketed in the past, where people can talk about things past truth, not truth, untruth. Hildebrand was a wonderful, wonderful writer for a German who Pius, I believe it was Pius XI actually called one of the modern doctors of the church. So he was born in the late 1800s, 1889, I believe, and he has this wonderful quote about how modern man doesn't recognize, or if it veers from the fact that things are true, good, and beautiful, they only see utilitarianism. And how true that quote holds up even today in today's culture, even though this gentleman lived 100 years ago. So it's a good thing to keep in mind this truth, beauty, and goodness as we're trying to recognize how we got from a quote like this, where we saw truth, to post-truth. It's easy to see that if you don't have a grounding in something, you could very easily fall into this trap of, well, we only learn things so that we can utilize them, especially in today's modern society. When we look at the culture today, we have a real crisis of meaning. Pope Francis talks about how young people nowadays don't necessarily know where they're going. They don't know what the purpose is behind their education, them earning money. Are we earning money just for the sake of purchasing things, material goods? And so how sad, our kids are asking all the time, either in the families or in our schools, why? Why do I need to do this? Why do I need to learn this? And if we don't give them a meaning other than you need to get a good grade, or so you get a good job, if we don't give them that far-reaching aspirational goal of so you can ultimately be reunited with Christ in heaven, how very uninspiring. We have a crisis of values. Congregation for Catholic Education, back in the 70s, wrote, this form is really moral relativism, subjectivity, nihilism, and when we're talking about a lack of values, that's where a lot of this comes from, and that idea of moral relativism, that idea that there is no truth we can adhere to, that everything is subjective. That's why apologetics are so difficult in today's age. Because you say, oh, maybe you think that's true, but that's not truth. The funniest part with that is you say, when people say, well, there's no truth, well, that's an absolute statement, right? So it doesn't compute. This young man here grew up to be a great leader of the church. Can anyone tell me who he is? All right. What do you think? You've got your hand halfway raised. Yes, well done. See, I even have a little bit older picture here just to help you out, but that was great. First try. So Pope Benedict has some great quotes throughout this presentation today. And he says, we have a crisis of commitments. The light of truth is indeed missing in a society where everything is relative. In fact, you could even say you doubt the validity of different relationships. So again, Pope Benedict, the scholar that he was pointing this out and has been pointing this out in various places in his addresses to the bishops while on our soil, in different encyclicals. He'll constantly bring this point up, that we must adhere to that idea of truth. And lastly, we have a culture crisis in education. problem in education nowadays, and this is not just in public schools, this is in a lot of Catholic schools too. The end goal is, how do we get our kids into the best colleges? How do we get them the best jobs? How do we make them successful as the world sees them, not necessarily as Christ sees them? And so when you have a educational experience where you're just trying to teach people how to learn how to do things, a worker bee mentality, where people learn things just for the sake of learning skills, not necessarily in order to pursue that excellence and grow closer to Christ himself, who is truth, that knowledge for knowledge's sake, because that brings us closer to him. When you break it down to just utility, then again, no wonder people are failing subjects, people can't connect. It's difficult to have cross-curricular integration when people say, well, I don't need to learn that over there, because I'm going to be an engineer. All I need is math, some science, maybe some critical thinking skills, but some of that other stuff, the histories, I don't need that because I'm staying focused on this track. And we say, that divides the human spirit, the holistic educational experience that we hope to infuse in our students. The fact that we say we educate the body, mind, and the soul, we can't break that apart, neither can we break apart the subjects that we should be teaching. Of course, people have different strengths and will lean more heavily into this subject or that subject, and that's great because we all want to fulfill our God-given talents and natural gifts. But again, by trying to fracture it too much, like we see so often in contemporary education, that's where we again see that it's not as aspirational as it should be. The last word that we had on that slide was postmodern. So interesting that in a postmodern society, the feelings take precedence. We talk about passions at war with themselves, for those of you that are philosophers. The passions at war. Without the will to direct that, oh boy, that's a scary world. We talk about, I think, or I feel, impressions versus actual data and analytical insights. That's where a lot of times if somebody is postmodern, they believe in unrestricted choice. They believe that they can do anything because, again, nothing truly has meaning. So those three words, looking at the culture crisis that unfortunately we're a part of today, by looking at the post-truth and the fact that we have a postmodern mentality in many places in the world today, that leads us, I have to show you this slide. This is a great little comment where, see at the very right, postmodern doesn't really go anywhere. So, when we have this uncertainty, lack of absolutes, progress is unlikely. You're just going to spin your wheels. You'll reinvent those wheels. You'll believe anything. This was a display up in the Museum of Modern Art up in New York. And it's funny that even though the Museum of Modern Art puts us out in that same city, the New York Times came out with a front page headline, "Truth. It's more important now than ever." There's still a fundamental interior. You talk about how everyone has a pull towards that natural, that intrinsic good, right? Even the New York Times recognizes that you can't go too far down crazy before you've got to come back. So that's why, I truly believe we have a lot of the challenges and troubles that we have in today's society, because we're post-Christian in many ways of the world. We're post-Christian in the way we approach our interactions, our education, our jobs, even our relationships. See, the gentleman down there is he's a modern day social critic. He writes a lot. He has some blog posts and has written numerous articles in conservative circles. But it's true though, where nothing's sacred, everything is indeed profane. That's why, those of us that are logical people steeped in virtue, that's why so many of these sentences up here just don't make sense. They can't make sense, not to a logical person that sees that there's a clear order, a natural order of things. How can you say that taking a life is choice. That doesn't make sense. And really, it's not that child's choice. All the way down to, tradition at the very bottom. Saying, okay, we can ignore tradition because we're more enlightened, we know more. Science has illumined more. Trying to fracture science with the natural symbiosis it has with faith. I'll leave you with this because, again, it's always interesting drawing comparisons, right? 1956, who was the top-ranked TV star? All right, so I know you've got the answer, so I'm gonna go right to the right of you. Yes.
I'm going to say Bishop Fulton Sheen.
Well done. Yes.
I'm old enough.
So how about that? Yeah, 30 million people bringing in our regular, annually, bringing those people in, teaching them with his chalkboard, his angel. Yeah. So it's neat to see that, and then you draw a comparison. The top page TV star in 2016 was also a Sheen, but how about that? Right? So we pull these juxtapositions out, and we show this not to depress, but just to further recognize the ridiculousness of once you get too far down a certain lexicon and adherence to values that aren't grounded in truth, this is where we end up. So that brings us to authentic Catholic education. So let's look at a couple of documents that have some great quotes. Again, I can share my own thoughts, but it's great looking right at primary sources, those forefathers, those church teachings when it comes to Catholic education. Is it visible in the Catholic education landscape that we have today? And then followed by talking about the challenges and opportunities that such a landscape, such a tradition presents. Cardinal George wrote this quote and published it before his death. And there's some great truth in here about how the mission of the church, when we talk about every age coming anew, the point and mission of the church is to introduce the world to its Savior. That's it. And when you introduce the Savior to the world in the appropriate way, a way that captures both the mind and the heart, they can't help but become on fire for that. This quest, this journey towards ultimate love, truth, goodness, beauty, who is Christ, God incarnate, that journey is the reason we have Catholic education, Catholic schools. It's why we have established throughout the world ways to educate folks. It's why in homeschooling circles, we have Colby Academy and Seed and Home Study and Mother of Divine Grace and these other tools to help parents show them that good and true and beautiful as they're seeking to educate their kids. This is another address from the good Pope Benedict. I'll point out just a couple of things in here because, again, in the very back, it may be a little difficult to see this. So, providing young people with a sound education in the faith represents the most urgent internal challenge facing the Catholic community in our country. This deposit of faith is a priceless treasure, which each generation must pass on to the next by winning hearts and shaping minds in the knowledge and understanding and love of its church. So again, he talks in that second paragraph about how we can't just capture the mind, right? We have to inflame the heart. I was fortunate enough to be a youth minister for 4 years. And one thing we always talked about when working with these youth from all over the place, different places, some that were in public education, others that came from Catholic education, some homeschoolers, we'd always say to our volunteers, we'd say, you can only give what you yourself have. Imagine a coal, right? Let's say your ardent and passionate desire for Christ was that coal and it was warm. It could keep you warm, but that's not going to catch other people on fire. That coal has to be a raging fire so that it can catch other people that are within the proximity of you, catch them on fire for the love of Christ. Mrs. Katie Matlack, the Father Matlack, is a new addition to our office this year. And she uses another wonderful analogy where she talks about being filled up with the Spirit and how you must be filled up and you must overflow, because if you try to give and continue to give without constantly filling yourself up, you'll deplete your store, as it were. You won't be able to overflow. You won't be able to give out what you do not have. So we say that that's why we must have this coupling of capturing the hearts and also training the mind. One last good story that I have is, have you ever heard of the Great Adventure Bible? All right. So the author there, yes? You wrote it? You own one. It's great. And the timeline and the great pictures that are in there, it's a great vehicle for helping us connect all the dots. So often in our religion classes, so often when we're telling the story of salvation history, we tend to break that up. Or we start with the catechism, which has wonderful truth in it, but we don't necessarily tie all those pieces together. The challenge with that is we're natural storytellers. That's why we love that when we read the gospel, we read the story of Christ. And when we go through the year and we do Lectio Divina, we love being able to see how all these pieces connect, because ultimately we need to see the big picture. If we try to fracture our faith, we can't truly fall in love with it, because no one falls in love with bits and pieces of different chapters. You have to read the whole story to fully encompass and understand how it all goes together. And by understanding that salvation history, similar to what they're trying to do in that Great Adventure Bible, Jeff Cavins, he's the one that wrote it. Yeah, he helped organize it. Yes, inspired by the Spirit. Yes, there were some other great men that wrote that story. But he was the one who helped organize it and who added the addition of the different timelines in there, which helped bring that whole story together. We have a wonderful collection of church documents that talk about what Catholic education is or should be. At the very bottom, it's tough to see. This is just a scattershot of different church documents, from different Vatican councils to the Congregation for Catholic Education to apostolic exhortations on the joy of the gospel. There are many, many teachings out there where we don't have to define Catholic education. It's already out there. But Archbishop Miller, he's the Archbishop up in Vancouver, he did a great job back, I believe it was 2005, distilling the 5 aspects, the 5 key things that make a Catholic school or Catholic education what it is. Many of these may be familiar to you. I know it's been promulgated out across the diocese at various times, but I just want to touch on each one just so we have a common vocabulary. So the first is inspired by a supernatural vision. What do you think that means? That plain and simply, yeah?
Communion with God, theosis.
Yes. So keeping in mind our ultimate goal, right? It's forming saints to reach salvation. So you have to have that supernatural goal, because if you stop short anywhere along the line, even if it's as noble a thing as, well, just to get you to your vocation, if you don't keep that ultimate end in mind, we have to always look at the why and the purpose behind why we're going into a particular vocation, why we're pursuing a particular career path, why we are training up young minds. So supernatural vision, absolutely. Founded on a Christian anthropology. So somebody help me out with that. How can we break that down?
What it means to be human.
The dignity, right, of each and every person is made in the image and likeness of God. Absolutely. What it means to be human. This is why we're so careful. I'll talk a little bit about how in the diocese we're looking at our gender policy. Because again, we were made in the image and likeness of God. And to fracture that, or to say he made a mistake in doing so, destroys that concept of a anthropology not given, not created by us, but given to us by God in his image and likeness. So that means also that human anthropology is we have to recognize how to educate individuals, no matter where they're coming from or what their background, and how to encourage them in that journey towards salvation in every step of the way, whether it is pre-K, elementary, middle school, high school, college, and adult formation. Third thing, animated by community and community. This is the line that we used when pushing back against the Mecklenburg Health Department when they were trying to shut our schools down this past year. We brought our lawyer in, and we said, because at this point right here, we must be back together in person. Because of the community that can only take place when we are together. We know people did a great job doing virtual learning. We moved that needle. Our teachers did a great job rolling with the punches, but a screen cannot replace human interaction. We are social creatures. Christ himself traveled with 12, right? So we need to have that communion, that Christian community, not only to learn together, but most importantly, in order to pray together. We also recognize that this is community not just within our own educational entities, but seeing ourselves an essential part of the Catholic Church's mission and as an essential part of the Catholic Church's structure. Being a part of the local church, that means working in communion and harmony with our parishes, with our pastors, with our bishop, with our different vicars, and recognizing that this communion was much easier when our schools were fully staffed by religious and clergy, because that was just inherent in that, in who they were, the gifts that they were given, and their vocation. This is why we've seen since 1965, the height of Catholic education, 10 million kids in Catholic schools, we've seen that decrease through the years. Partially because as laity, well-intentioned, maybe not well-formed, but well-intentioned laity come in, good leaders that really want to do what was best, they didn't necessarily have all the training or even necessarily the skills to help bring that idea of Christian community from the parish to the school and the greater church into their classroom. When we look at it, the landscape, so back in 65, we had about 95% staffed by clergy or laity. And now, in this past year, we're at about 2.5% staffed by clergy or religious in our schools. So that proves an inherent challenge, not insurmountable, but just an inherent challenge in helping our teachers, who again are very well intentioned. We have many, many wonderful educators across the United States that want their kids to become saints, but there are many others that have been trained in the technique, the art, and the science of teaching, but don't always have that ecclesial foundation, which was just inherent to the religious that were in the schools. So that's why some of that communion has dissipated. So we're trying to bring that back together. Number 4 is imbued with a Catholic worldview throughout the curriculum. Can somebody break this down for me? No, it's kind of plain and simple on the surface, but what does that mean in actuality and practicality?
Well, an integration in all that we do, right? A Catholic worldview is that you can't separate out, your soul from what you're doing, or your mission from what you're doing, or history. I think it's all going to be centered towards for Christ, through Christ. Absolutely.
That's great. If you couldn't hear her, she was saying that everything is centered for Christ, towards Christ, and that you cannot separate out or fracture, using the word we used earlier, those subjects, those ideas, those subject matters, right? A holistic, faithful education recognizes that there must be cross-curricular integration, and that every subject, no matter whether it's the sciences, whether it is the arts, whether it is PE class, whether it is social studies or history, whether it's theology, that all of those must pursue that pearl of great price, that underlying truth that all of these things have been given by God for the greater glory of God. So again, if we subdivide subjects, one, it makes it tough because students feel like they are having to restart each time they enter a new classroom, right? They have to go in and it's a lot easier when you can connect the dots. That's why we teach kids little limericks and ways to remember things by putting the pieces together. But if you say, okay, well, in English class, we're learning about this novel, which took place during the 16th century, and then we go to social studies or history, and we're sharing what happened during that time, but we don't try to bridge the two, it's that much harder for people to make those connections, because many times students are pursuing a grade or a quiz score or the end of the bell, the end of the school day, and not trying to make those connections. So we must always have that Catholic worldview throughout its curriculum, and also recognize that providence is a wonderful thing. You start to see the way that the incarnation happened, and from that point forward, actually from the beginning of time, but more distinctly when the incarnation happened from that point forward, how God has guided his church through the ups and downs, through the crises, to land in a spot where we are today. That's what gives us great hope, is yes, there are crazy things going on, but we are so fortunate that we have divine providence helping guide us to these places. When you look back at those places where you prayed, you were perhaps nudged, and you made decisions that took you in a direction that, looking back, seems like you never could have gone there on your own, that's providence. And so that's why we need to make sure that our educational journey reflects that as well. And then sustained by gospel witness. This is perhaps one of the most influential pieces of all five when it comes to the education of youth. And why is that?
Because it's proof that the education works, seeing examples of it living among saints.
Yeah. Yep, learning from the example of the saints and heroes that have come before us, seeing the wonderful alumni, people that have grown up to do great things for the glory of God, but also because when students are learning from the very youngest age, when they are learning, they model, right? They model what they see, the actions that they see. And so that's why every educator, the parents, the teachers, they must all model that Christ witness. Be an embodiment of Christ in all that they do, regardless of what they're doing or which subject they're teaching. Because at the end of the day, that Catholic education will be sustained by the witness that those educators are giving to those students. You've probably heard the saying that it's not what you say, it's how you make them feel, right? You could also say it's not what you say, but it's how you act, how you treat them, because that is what's going to make a lasting impact. When I was very fortunate to start out as a teacher, and I would sometimes get frustrated, one, that I wouldn't get all the way through a curriculum, or that I wouldn't perhaps have taught well enough such that the kids only got an 80 or a 90 on the test. And in hindsight, I have to look back and say, okay, well, those facts and figures are important. Rigor is important. Memorization, different skills, those are important. But it's most important that they understand why they're learning what they're learning, how to defend the beliefs that they're being taught, and how to spread that truth when they go out into the world. So we started by saying, the mission of the church in every generation is to introduce the world to its Savior. It also means that Catholic education must be accessible to every single family that so chooses it. Has to. The church already has a inclination to serve the poorest of the poor, to serve those less fortunate. But it also recognizes that it has to necessarily serve, by assisting the parents, has to serve all those other people, regardless of what socioeconomic background they come from, regardless of what they look like, regardless of their learning ability. The church must do that because Catholic education is a gift that must be promulgated out to all who desire it. So look at the challenges. I think we have to be upfront with some of the challenges. That last point that I made about accessibility, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but lots of times our schools aren't always accessible, especially if families are fruitful and multiply. and you have a lot of kids. Catholic education is expensive because, frankly, it costs a lot to keep a school running. But that's not an excuse to not provide Catholic education to this family. So we'll get to that in a few minutes. But the challenges of Greater Church are the same ones faced in many of our schools. So a few of these challenges: the fact that people are just leaving the church. Can you tie it back to poor formation in their youth? Probably. Can you tie it back to an increasing secular culture? Of course. But we see, from 1945, 1956, those high points of baptisms and marriages, that it's really been declining at an alarming rate. And this is not news to pastors and other priests that see that the church, is aging. This is a 6-year baptism projection coupled with first graders enrolled in Catholic schools. And we see, of course, there is a correlation, not necessarily a causation, but a correlation where you have shrinking numbers of kids enrolled in first grade in Catholic schools and a decreasing number of Catholic baptisms. What does that tell us? That tells us that parents don't necessarily understand the value or do not see the value of a Catholic education. They also don't necessarily see the value of raising their kids Catholic. When we look at weekly mass attendance, and these numbers are a few years old, but even so, you look at pre-Vatican II, it was a different time. Absolutely, there wasn't as much, the population wasn't as transient. So there's a certain, you grew up in this neighborhood, it was a habit. You knew Father, he'd walk down the street and say hello to everybody. It was a different time, granted. But even so, you look at how things dropped after Vatican II. You look at Catholic teens today, and it's interesting. So the last large research project that went out that looked at regular mass attendance showed that Catholics, cradle Catholics that were raised going to church with their families, that by the time they graduated school, from public school, it was about 25% would continue to go to church. Whether that was a couple times a year, weekly, they would at least still attend church. Now that number did jump up if they went to Catholic school, but still a Catholic school is only 35%. So again, it shows us work to do. It shows that there's a significant difference between the two, but still, that's a pretty low number. And there's other pieces at play there, right? We see faithful families, families united, families that pray together, practice sacramental devotions together. Those kids, of course, tend to retain their faith. So there's other aspects we'd have to look at, but just from the onset, that 25 and 35 is pretty interesting to look at. We see teens of other Christian traditions, they're dropping as well. We see the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-S, and we see this across the board, but Christian communities that emphasize community tend to retain better because there's an accountability, there's a community there. They don't have the full truth, but that tends to be why their numbers are a little bit higher. So there you go, you see some of those numbers. So let's talk about the present landscape of our schools. So enrollment, like I said, 65, you had about 10 million at last count with the National Catholic Education Association's data. So you were hovering right around 2 million students in Catholic schools. It's a pretty large drop. It's interesting, the rise of homeschooling, especially we saw COVID shot the homeschooling numbers up quite a bit. But the homeschooling numbers, and you may have to correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was around 3 to 4 million across all faiths. So it's just interesting to see that too. We've seen the shrinking there, but we've also seen the rise in homeschooling, which is a direct indication of parents recognizing their roles as primary educators of their kids and saying, hey, if they're not getting it in the public schools, or even sadly, sometimes in Catholic schools, we're going to take the reins or we're going to make this happen. Religious teaching in schools, we already talked about that. accessibility pathways, oftentimes we hear of Catholic schools, particularly high schools, being called college prep, right? And that's because, especially back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, a surefire way to get a good job was to go to college, you have a degree, and there you go, you're set. And the church in her wisdom knew that education is the path out of poverty. It is the path out of challenging situations. And so a lot of Catholic schools responded in such and created environments that provided excellent academic formation, where we look at the Supreme Court, and I know some of them are not a testament to our Catholic faith tradition, but 6 of the 9 went through Catholic schools. They're the highest thought grouping, in the world's eyes, right? Secular grouping, the most wisdom in one small group of people right there, and 6 of the 9 went to Catholic schools. We know that people that go through Catholic schools have done very well financially. In fact, when it comes to serving those more disadvantaged, just like Catherine Drexel, who we prayed to today, she set up Catholic schools for particularly Native Americans and African American students. Those kids do much, much better going through Catholic schools because, again, I'd like to say we look at people as individual souls and not necessarily as numbers, and we tend to go above and beyond for those individuals that need it most. So, in general, even in the world's view, Catholic schools create good citizens who tend to vote more, donate more hours to their community, create better citizens who vote more often, earn more, are higher educated, have more stable families, and particularly better serve the least among us. In fact, a recent number that came out showed that Catholic education saves the United States government, public education, about $24 billion a year. So it is, and this is another sidebar conversation for another time, to talk about plurality and looking at support of institutions, but in a good sense, it's good that we're divided from the government because of less strings and less accountability into secular society. So we tend to do well. We even tend to do well when it comes to religious formation vocations. There are more that come out of Catholic schools, and there are more adherents to Mass and sacramentals than that come out of public schools. We just saw that with that number. Still not great, but better than in public institutions. So all that being said, though, we don't always educate as best or as we should, creating different pathways for students to succeed in whatever vocation they should pursue. That's changing a little bit. There's a little bit of a sticker shock when it comes to especially state colleges, secular colleges, where those prices have gone up through the roof. And we've recognized that if people are going to pursue their God-given talents, that it's okay if they go into the trades. It's okay if they pursue the military and serve the country. It's okay if they do these things and not necessarily have to go the traditional college route. So while we've traditionally been college prep, there is a movement for us to look at alternative pathways for success for those students. How do we do mission-wise? I talked a few minutes ago about how there are very well-intentioned people in our Catholic schools. That's a known fact, and the reason is they could go somewhere else and get a lot more money and do greater things in the eyes of the world than come and work in a Catholic school. So you have people that are very well-intentioned in our schools. You have a lot of people that are well-formed, that know their faith, understand, know how to share it. But you also have many teachers that aren't well-formed. And so when it comes to that cross-curricular integration, when it comes to that pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful, sometimes, if there's a math teacher or a science teacher who doesn't necessarily understand or have the training, through no fault of their own necessarily, or even maybe it's just not even an awareness, they don't necessarily infuse those gospel values or those curriculum techniques into their everyday teaching lexicon. And there's a fracturing there. They say, okay, well, religion is meant for theology class, or it's meant when the chaplain comes around to lecture. It's not inherent to this subject. So that's part of the landscape. We've seen accessibility prove to be a problem. I taught in the Arlington Diocese, and there were many good things there and a lot of financial aid, but the sticker price at least was around $17,000 for a high school education. That's a pretty tough hurdle if you have multiple kids, or you come from a background where your parents can't provide that, right? So there are accessibility challenges. The average cost across the United States for Catholic education is around $5,000 to $6,000. That's how much the average tuition cost is. The average, or the cost to educate, even though it's a little bit higher than that, there's usually a gap of $3,000 to $4,000 in what that cost to educate is. You know, I mentioned up in New York. In New York, they spend about $22,000 per pupil. So we tend to do a lot with very little. But again, we're primarily tuition driven, which is why tuition rates tend to keep going up, because we need to create a living wage for teachers. So we need to look at alternative income sources and find ways to look at endowments, that sort of thing, to help our education be more accessible to those who desire it. Pope John Paul II, we started with a quote of his. He likes to use truth a lot. So you'll see in this quote, he uses truth again. But he also talks that the truth will set you free, quoting John right there, but also that the world needs educational institutions which uphold that truth. We talk about, in general, where the United States is as far as education and challenges that the education environment poses. And again, my disclaimer is that there are many good institutions out there. There are some wonderful public school educators who are my friends, and my uncle and other people that work in public education who are forwarding the mission of the church, despite some of the challenges that come with Common Core and some of the other things. But in general, we see the reason that we keep reinventing the wheel. We have project-based learning, then we have open classrooms, and then we have Common Core and these other trends, is because we tend to try to put Band-Aids on it without getting to the heart and intrinsic value of education as a greater purpose than just utility one. A couple of things that we're doing in the diocese, and recognizing that these are some of the things that we need to tackle. It's been a good year. It really has been. Despite the challenges of COVID, it allowed us to reorient on our mission. I talked about how we use the word community, Christian community, to keep our schools open, and we did. Let's say here at St. Michael's, you are living out the mission and have had a wonderful experience this entire year of bringing people together, bringing new families in. And so it has been a wonderful year. We have other things that we're working on as well. A virtues program, working with the Good Sisters out of Ann Arbor, the Dominican Sisters, implementing that in our diocese. We're starting with a pilot program next year, and already here at St. Michael's, you all have a great foundation of that. So we'll be looking to you as some of the leaders in that. We're re-emphasizing parents as the first educators. We started to use the term that we enroll families, not students. There's an obligation and a responsibility that comes on both fronts. We've changed our contract language to read teacher minister, understanding that right from the get-go, those that come to work for us in this mission need to understand that they are expected to be a Christian witness, not just in the classroom, but in their private life that might become public on social media. We're working on a living wage for our teachers, working to try and find ways to provide accessible Catholic education by either bumping up salaries, by being very intentional in the way that we can allow them to send their own kids to our schools. We're getting rid of certain barriers to entry. We know that certain in families that have well-formed consciences, and as seen in canon law, a family that has a well-formed conscience, at times they are not able to immunize or vaccinate, either fully or completely. So we've done away with that requirement across the diocese. Adherence to the magisterium, recognizing again that we are part of a larger church. So it has been wonderful. We brought our school board here to St. Michael's, and the first thing we saw was Father and Michelle and Miss Volman next to each other when we showed up. That's so important. It sends such a message that our school and our parish are one in the same mission, and that the leader of this entire campus, Father Rossi, was here with the school leader to usher us in. Focus on formation of vocations with salvation as our goal. Some of that language is in the contract, some of that language is being placed into evaluations, but we're meeting together as principals to talk about some of the upcoming goals in relation to greater community and adherence to the magisterium. So I'm looking forward to that conversation tomorrow. And a couple other things that we started to use more is this idea of truth, beauty, and goodness. You know, again, as parents are the first educators, we have a variety of different education vehicles throughout the diocese, different schools with different charisms. But it's great that here at St. Michael's, you are pursuing a classical education experience where it is more easily visible that search for that pearl of great price, that underlying truth. Every Catholic school should have elements of this, the good, the true, and the beautiful, and many of them do. And we see this many, many times in classrooms throughout our entire diocese, throughout the entire U.S. But again, a fundamental principle of what you're doing here at St. Michael's is the fact that you'll keep that first and foremost. This is a snapshot preview of our revamped mission. At the beginning of this year, our principals got together and put down some words that they thought embodied what we should be as Catholic schools. Some of those red words are draft words that we're trying to figure out how best to finesse this before it becomes final. So again, this will be final very, very soon, and we'll finalize it tomorrow. But I figured it'd be a great opportunity to do a sneak peek of where we're going with it. So again, everything starts with mission. When you talk to the Beckett Foundation or the Beckett Fund, the ones who defended the Little Sisters of the Poor, they'll say, double down on your mission. Know what your mission is, make sure everyone can speak to it, make sure it's clear, and make sure it's aspirational. So we're hoping that's what, well, we're not hoping, we know that this message up here is aspirational. We also know that there's a vision of where we want to go with our schools. Again, some red words at the bottom that we're deciding whether or not we'll keep them in, knowing that they have different connotations. But we feel pretty good about where we want to go as a diocese. A lot of this is just coming right back to our core Catholic identity. We have church teachings to lean on. We have a great foundation and deposit of faith. Now it's just a matter of reorienting on that and seeing what that looks like and how that's expressed. We're grateful to have the support of all of our parents, and the very last thing we'll talk about is parents as the first educators, because that is first and foremost the cornerstone bedrock of our society and of our schools. But everything that we're doing, we're recognizing it's going to take courage. It took courage to be the largest educational entity in North Carolina that was open 5 days a week, full face-to-face, this past year. It took a lot of courage. We knew it was the right thing to do. We know that it struck to the core of our mission. So it wasn't it wasn't a difficult choice to make that we were doing it, but it did take courage when folks were calling us up and saying, why are you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? So we must continue to put on to the deep. Just as we expect our students to be well-formed, to be ships that we don't keep safe in the harbor, but that we go out to evangelize, so too must we as educators continue to promulgate the faith and really not be afraid to say, we are Catholic educators, this is what we believe, here's why we believe it, and here's why you should come join us. We continue to work on not just the faith aspect, but on the rigor aspect as well. I love this quote at the top, that piety is no excuse for excellent technique. We're called to great things. We have a greater responsibility, some could say, because of our calling to educate the mind, the body, and the soul. So because of that, we must be excellent in teaching the things of the world, those subject matters that will lead us closer to Christ, but we must be able to do so well. We must be able to do so with a faithful and joyful attitude as well. It's great being an Easter people, right? It's so good being an Easter people where we can have that joy and it can be expressed, because even despite the challenges, all the postmodern stuff, that's okay. Battle's already been won. It may mean the church becomes more intentional. It may mean that those that seek Catholic education or that continue to come to church, maybe those numbers drop because we've clarified our mission and said, look, there's an obligation and responsibility that comes with being a part of our church. But that's okay, because again, we know that Christ started the church and he'll sustain it through providence. I have to show this though too, when we're talking about excellent technique. It means as an educator, I've had to shift the way I work with folks, people that have been raised in this age. There are some little teaching tips and tricks that we've had to recognize in order to break through and reach people, not acquiescing to what they believe or tolerating what they believe, but just to begin dialogue with them. So we were talking about ways that we can do this, and these are a few ways. There's a difference too, I want to always clarify, there's a difference between tolerance and charity, right? So we want to make sure that, we're very charitable in the way and pastoral in the way we work with people, especially if they're not formed in the same way, we are, because we have 20% of our kids in our schools are non-Catholic. And we have a number of educators in our system that are non-Catholic. Something bright and visible drew them in and want to, inspire them to want to be a part of our school system. So we have to be sensitive to that and invite them into this mission and evangelize, but recognize too that if people are in different places in the faith journey, we can't judge, but we have to find ways to hold our expectations high, keep that bar raised high, but bring them up, raise them up, and help them out. So, we need to bring people along, right? We need to follow Christ and make sure that people are following our example as leaders. That's what we're called as a church militant, right? We are instilled with the authority and the ability and the grace to lead others to Christ, regardless of what vocation we're in. So that takes me to the very last time, and I appreciate your attention tonight. So we start with parents as a bedrock. And we have a wonderful picture of the Holy Family up there. So good talking about this in the year of St. Joseph. Point out a couple of things up here is parents must be recognized. This is from 1965 in Vatican II as a primary and principal educators. Parents are the ones who must create a family atmosphere animated by love and respect for God and man, and where the well-rounded personal and social education of children is fostered. It all starts with the family. That's why whatever we do, in Catholic education or out in the world, we must preserve that understanding that parents are the first educators. They are partners in this mission. Sometimes that means we have to educate them on what that means, because some parents don't know. Some people think, okay, I drop my kid off at school and that's that, and the church or the school takes care of it, but it doesn't end there. There is indeed an obligation when it comes to being a part of Catholicism for the parents. And that's something that started right with baptism, right? In the rite of baptism, you promise to raise them such that they will be formed and reach salvation. And a part of that is education so that they know the good, the true, and the beautiful. When we talk about them partnering with schools, we saw the Sacred Congregation for Catholic Education in 1977 say, this responsibility of making sure their kids are raised in an orthodox way and understand the teaching of the church rests first and foremost with the parents. Now, they do say that an important role belongs to the teachers in safeguarding and developing that distinct mission. But again, it starts with the parents and working with the parents. The word that's there is they are bound to cooperate actively with the school. So there's an inherent trust that takes place where parents who have done their due diligence or research, they know what the charism of that school is, that educational entity. There's a certain trust that takes place where you hand over your child for part of the day and trust that they will be well formed and trust the guidance of the educators that are in that school environment. There's also